Good afternoon, everybody. Everyone in the room can hear me well. Wave if you can't. Great. I got a thumbs up, so that's great. Let me introduce myself. I'm Jacqueline Sundberg. I'm outreach librarian here with Aurora Collections, and it really is a pleasure to welcome all of you to today's event. I get the pleasure of introducing three of my colleagues today who are going to be conducting today's workshop. So I'll introduce them in a moment, but just a couple of housekeeping notes. We're live here in the room, and we're also live online. So welcome to everyone who's tuning in on YouTube. If you do have questions for our presenters, you can email those. The email address is roar.library@mcgill.ca. So we will have a Q&A session after the presentation part. So if you are joining us online, please do send in your comments or questions, and I will be your mouthpiece today. My pleasure to do so. We are here on site today, and for those of you who are on site, you may have noticed there is a tent set up on Lower Campus. It's set up right behind the Hochelaga Rock, and it's actually a really interesting opportunity. If you have the chance, you can drop by on your way out. I encourage you to investigate it for yourself, but it's a reminder very much of the fact that we are on land that has long served as a place of meeting and exchange for Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. We really do acknowledge and respect those diverse Indigenous peoples who have long been stewards of this land and whose presence mark this territory on which peoples of the world now gather and exchange ideas. And today's topic, Genealogy 201, investigating methods and tools and resources available for doing this kind of genealogical work, is really a way to trace relations, trace roots, and to get to know the resources that are now available to us on this place. So I wanted to take a moment to think about the land where we are and to point you to one of the ways, tangible ways that on campus today, people are exploring that Indigenous heritage. So I encourage you to, if you have time, do stop by outside. There's a tent, and there you can learn more about Innu culture there. For today, welcome. I'm going to pass the microphone to my colleagues now who are going to introduce themselves in turn, but I do welcome you here in the room. We have some items at the front, so later on, after the presentation portion, you can come and see some of these resources in person, but I do ask, and I'll say it now so I don't forget. There's one item up here on the truck, and we just ask that you don't touch that one. The rest of them you can interact with. So that's the end of my housekeeping notes, other than, for those in the room, if you do need the washrooms, it's back down the hall that you came in and take a left after the gallery hall. So those at home, you can find your own washrooms. And on that note, I'll leave my colleagues to introduce themselves. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline, and hello, everyone. My name is Kristen Howard, and I am a historian, a settler, and an assistant librarian at the Humanities and Social Sciences Library here at McGill. I'm also joined today by my colleagues Jen Riley and Dolores LaPratte, who are going to introduce themselves when we get to their portion of the talk. But I'm very excited. It's our pleasure to be your presenters for this homecoming event, Genealogy 201, Finding Information in McGill's Collections and in Indigenous Records. In addition to the tent outside that Jacqueline talked to you about, there are also, for homecoming, there are visits to various libraries, McGill's Visual Arts Collection, and a guided tour of the Voltaire exhibition happening just outside this room throughout the weekend, offered in both English and French. So please do join us for our other McGill Library portions of homecoming. So today I'm going to talk to you about the online genealogical databases that we have available for McGill alumni. I'm going to talk about 4 different things that we have available to you. The first 2 things I'm going to talk about are available to all members of the public, and the second 2 things are available just to our current McGill students, faculty, and staff, and luckily to our alumni as well. So I want to get started with our old McGill yearbooks. So we have wonderfully digitized our yearbooks from 1898 through 2000, which are readily available for anybody to access online. Something that's really fantastic about these, and as a librarian, I answer this kind of reference question all the time. How do I find out about my relative or my ancestor who went to McGill? How can I learn more about them? And we often point people to the yearbooks. The yearbooks have been fully digitized with optical character recognition, which means that you can search them for names. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up to show you, and I have to switch over here. Ooh, we are not happily switching. And wouldn't you know, I practiced this before we talked to make sure that I wasn't going to have this problem while working on this today. It is not going to work for me, but that is okay. You can search by name in that search box right there. Usually it will operate best if you search by last name, comma, first name. So if you attended McGill between 1898 and 2000, I highly recommend that you go ahead and try your own name or a friend's name. If you did not attend McGill by any chance, the fun example I often like to share is that of William Shatner. So if you put in Shatner, comma, William, you will be very delighted to find William Shatner's very recognizable photo from his youth come up, and the quote that he chose for himself. You can also search by clubs or activities at McGill, also in the box. So you aren't limited just to names. You can also put in sports or other activities that someone participated in. So one that I often like to show as an example is the Cosmopolitan Club of McGill. This was a club that was founded by Jamaican student Ainsworth David Scott in 1920 in order to, according to the club, quote, provide equality between the nationalities and races on campus. So it was one of the first clubs at McGill where we had a lot of participation from students of color from a variety of countries. So if you search for Cosmopolitan Club, for example, you'll find photographs of the people who were president and secretary, as well as information about the activities that students in that club did. So that's another way that you could interact with the yearbooks. I will also say that the OCR is not perfect. One of the things that we do in yearbooks, or that students have often done in yearbooks, is try to make them look very fun and appealing by doing things like putting text either at an angle or totally up and down, and the optical character recognition isn't as good at reading that. So it's not going to be perfect when you look for things, but it will give you a really good idea of the kinds of things that you can find. The second resource that I will share are the McGill student publications. We've again fully digitized the McGill student publications from 1875 all the way to 2001. And the chief long-standing student newspaper at McGill, the McGill Daily, was founded in 1911. And so these are fully accessible online, and again, they are accessible via optical character recognition. So you can again search for things like you could put in the Cosmopolitan Club, and then it will bring up all the results, and you can see what it was reported on that the Cosmopolitan Club was doing, like Halloween parties, masquerade balls, or some of the things that you can find. So you can again put in students' names to see if things come up, or activities, clubs, or even disciplines that you know that somebody was involved in. So those are great ways to find information about either your own times at McGill or about relatives or ancestors who attended McGill in the past. So those are the two online options I wanted to share that are available to everyone regardless of affiliation. So the next two databases I'm going to share are available just to McGill current students, faculty, and staff, and very happily to alumni. So the first is this database called Migration to New Worlds. And this explores the movement of peoples from continental Europe, Britain, and Ireland to North America and Australasia during the 19th and 20th centuries. So in this database, there are some what, as a historian, I might call an ego document, documents like diaries or letters. It's not very likely that the diary or letters of your own ancestor are in this database. If they are, you would probably already know about that. But that doesn't mean that as somebody who's interested in genealogy and your own past roots, that you can't find a lot of information in this database that will help you understand what it was like for someone to emigrate and what that experience was like. In this database in particular, under the introduction at the top red tab, if you click that, then you are able to see something called thematic areas. And I highly recommend that you explore the thematic areas, motives for emigration, where we see a lot of information about why people might have chosen to leave continental Europe, Britain, and Ireland at this time, and what they were looking for in new areas, such as Canada, new areas to them, such as Canada, and also journey conditions, which gives a lot of information about what it was like on ships, for example. So you might not be able to use this like the yearbooks to find your exact ancestor, but this is a wonderful way for you to explore what it was like for somebody who was actually emigrating. The second database is called North American Immigrant Letters, Diaries, and Oral Histories. Again, available to McGill users and alumni, and like the previous one, although this is primarily a database of ego documents, and it's about people who immigrated to America and Canada between 1800 and 1950. I would be very surprised if you found the diary or letters of your own ancestor, but this again gives you a lot of information about what it was like for these individuals. One of the ways that I like to look through this is in this browse section right here. One of the tiles that you can click is called Place Discussed. If you click into Place Discussed, you can then select North America and then Canada. And when you click on that, it brings up everything that's attached specifically to Canada. And it gives some really wonderful brochures and monographs that were published in order to entice people to come from continental Europe, Britain, and Ireland to Canada. What was so wonderful about Canada for potential immigrants. So if you have an ancestor who came to Canada or to the United States, this is really wonderful to get an idea of what was being told to people back in Europe about why they might want to come here. So again, these two databases are available to anybody who is a McGill alumni, and you'll be able to access them through the links that we have on the screen, and we also have a virtual handout with all the links that we're going to share today that you'll be able to use instead of having to write these down as fast as you can. So those are the 4 online databases that I wanted to share, and I'm now going to hand it off to my colleague Jen Riley, who's going to talk about information that are available in archives and special collections.
Thank you, Kristen. So my name is Jen Riley. I'm an associate dean here in the library at McGill, and I am a dual U.S. and Canadian citizen. I'm a 5th generation settler, and all 16 of my 2 times great-grandparents were born on North American soil to settler families from Europe. So I imagine many of you are here because you've done genealogical research on your own families. And if you began your work in the last 20 years or so, you probably used Family Search or Ancestry.com or some site like that. You might have used Find a Grave or RootsWeb, which doesn't really exist anymore. And you probably have lines where you're completely stuck. There's nothing left to find, and you're ready to move to the next level. Well, I'm going to show you how to use materials, like these ones in the room, that you can find in special collections and archives that can help you with your research. So as Kristen was saying, Genealogy 2.0 is based on the idea that you're not just researching your ancestor, you're researching the context in which they live. You want to start by reading as much as you can about the time and the place they were in, as many documents as possible that were created during that time period, so you learn about how the culture worked. And by doing all that, you'll get a fuller version of the people who came before you, and maybe some brick wall breakers in the process. So some of the records you've already consulted on Ancestry or Family Search were digitized from collections in county or state archives, but a lot of them were actually just as many were from libraries and archives like McGill's. We sometimes call these special collections libraries that have rare books and some of the manuscripts you see here. Sorry, I lost my place. There we go, okay. So you can search library and archives websites to find materials, but even when you do that, you may not find everything they have. They may not have everything cataloged. You can talk with librarians and archivists, and if you keep looking, you might find some diamonds in the rough. And just to prepare you, there might be microfilm involved, so don't get scared. So special collections, libraries, and archives have reading rooms. You came through one on the way here, where researchers consult the materials. It's generally good practice to contact the library archive ahead of time with a detailed list of what you want to consult, because the materials probably aren't all on site. They're probably not easy to get very quickly. And in these reading rooms, they have the institution will have policies about what you're able to do and what you're able to bring into those reading rooms. You'll typically be allowed a laptop, note paper, and pencils, probably not pens. And most libraries allow photography without a flash, but some don't, so be aware before you bring your equipment. So what we're showing today is that the historical print holdings of libraries and archives have tons of information for genealogists, but the question is how you find what you're going to look at. So you start with the repository's website. So here's the site for McGill Library and Archives. We've put a handy search box right on the front page. And if you click that blue box on the left that says search, you'll see there's a couple choices. The two we're interested in today are entire catalog and the archival catalog. So we're going to start with the entire catalog. And if you can see, it's very small. We were doing a search for Levels Montreal City Directory. So you're probably familiar with this kind of results page. There's information about what matched your search. There's a physical location or a link. So I've searched for city directories because they're a really good resource for taking that next genealogical step. So city directories are the precursors to phone books. They were published annually and typically contained alphabetical lists of primarily heads of households and businesses. The leading English language Montreal publication was Levels, Montreal City Directory, which first appeared in 1842. And we've got a couple copies of that from a couple years up here. We've got a very teeny one from the mid-19th century, and we've got a giant one from the 1950s. So you can see how it's evolved over time. So the other reason city directories are a good resource to use is a lot of them are digitized and online, including the Montreal ones. So you're not just looking to find facts, remember, you're looking to understand context. So with city directories, the first thing I do is to read the introduction. And that'll give you a sense of what you'll find inside, businesses, people, where the boundaries are. So that'll help you consider what might be silently missing. So for the Lowell's directory, the introduction says that they created the information by walking around town and knocking on doors. So who might be missing in that scenario? Well, people of lower socioeconomic circumstances, francophones, so think about who might not be represented fully here in this picture that this directory is painting of Montreal. So they'll typically include the head of household and any working sons. And widows would show up, and in later years, single women who worked outside the house, but not in the 19th century. So be careful. These little red boxes are not showing up properly, I apologize, but be careful to not assume everybody with the same last name is the same family. They're almost certainly not. This is a phone book, remember, so you're just looking at people with that last name. There's nothing here, there's nothing in the grouping that says they're families. But the addresses may give you a hint. You can't really see it here, but two of these people have addresses that are next to each other. I think it's 535 and 537, so that gives you some suggestion that those people might really be related. And what you can do after that is, once you've found somebody in the alphabetical directory and found an address, you can go to a different part of the city directory and look where it's organized by street. And here you can look up the street number and who lived at that house. And again, it's not the entire family unit, it's the head of household and perhaps some older working sons that are single, but it'll help you find neighbors and other people that could be connected to your family. So finally, the Montreal directories contain what they call miscellaneous directories. So this includes a lot of businesses. So you'll see people listed who are in management for local banks, for churches. One of these entries has the organist, in case that's your ancestor. Officers of local clubs, administrators of schools, all the way up to McGill University. So you'll see who's in leadership positions in each of these organizations, and you can understand a little bit more about Anglophone Montreal in that time period. So luckily, as I mentioned before, the entire run of the Levels directories have been digitized, and they're online at the BANQ's website. So I want to look at professional directories next. So here's a French language directory of doctors and surgeons in the province of Quebec, and we'll note that it was published in 1908. We're usually looking for stuff a little older than that, but this is a good example, I think. So you see, this is mostly a list of doctors and surgeons that were active at that time. So you'll see names, you'll see locations, you'll see the degree they earned with the dates, and you'll see the date they registered, which I'm assuming is registered as a practicing doctor in Quebec. You may learn more about your ancestor, and if it's a doctor, it's almost certainly a him, by looking at these directories and finding the addresses are really gold, so that a lot of times you won't have addresses for people. So there are directories from tons of different professions. There's engineers, there's lawyers, there's architects, policemen, surveyors, grocers, dairies and fromageries, and cattle ranchers, and my favorite, poultry breeders. So you'll see it's organized by breed. So you can tell, if you want a certain breed of chicken or hen, you can get one there. And also, well, if you can start to track migration patterns. If you know the profession somebody was in, if you know what their specialization was, it helps you see that where that same cultivation is happening, so that you can track them. And you also find fun things as well. So apparently there was only need for one peacock breeder in Montreal, they're not multiple, and for some reason they threw rabbits into the poultry breeding. So it's just fun to look at this stuff. So I want to cover next these resources that I call the scholarly settler history. And so these are typically extensive written volumes containing the history of a place and the people who built it in the settler sense. They were invariably written by white men, often clergy or university professors, who write with this learned air of authority so that you think they're knowledgeable about the subject. These were really popular from about 1850 to 1930, and you'll find a ton of them in genealogical libraries and in rare book libraries like this one. We have a couple on display up here that you can take a look at if you like. So sometimes they'll have a preliminary chapter or two that describe the indigenous people who originally made that place their home, and almost invariably you'll find them rife with stereotypes and language that we now understand to be abhorrent and harmful. So this is the typical one. We're looking at chapter 4, what's his name? Peter Miller and his descendants. And it starts with a lovely poem revering the past. So we've got a lot of, we're getting a sense of what the tone is here. And actually I'll back up and show you, the title of this tells you what you can, gives you a good sense of what you can find in the book. It's the Camden Colony, Seed of the Righteous. So you know what perspective this is going to take before you start reading. So the poem reinforces that. And then you get into just page after page of dense writing, long paragraphs, long sentences, but there's names in here. There's so-and-so moved from this city to that city and married this person. And it is just rife with information. You'll find notable citizens mentioned, and you'll often find stories about encounters with famous people that are probably more myth than legend. In this particular book, you find at the end about 60 pages of genealogical material. There's written out family group information, so this structure may look familiar to many of you, and there's also genealogical charts, pedigree charts. So if you think all the way back to when I started, we searched the library catalog, everything, for resources of interest. So now I want to really quickly do a search of the archival catalog. So here's a specific collection that may be of interest to some of you, the McGill University Archives collection. It's what we call an artificial collection in that the items were brought together by the archives itself rather than being a coherent set of materials generated by a person or a business in the course that they're doing business. Like most archival collections, it's arranged hierarchically into series and then files. And files typically contain materials that are together for a functional reason. Maybe they're all the same type of content, the same language, correspond to the same person, etc. This particular collection has files that are generally one item. That's a little unusual. You usually find groups. But some of the files in this collection have been digitized. So if you do find something that's been digitized, it's great. You can look at it online. If you find something here that's not been digitized, you can make an appointment to come to this reading room and view the materials. So perhaps your family member played hockey while they were at McGill. You found that out by looking at the yearbooks. Well, This ephemera collection happens to have a hockey program. They don't have all the hockey programs, they only have a few, but they found their way into a collection and you can use them to see what McGill was like, and maybe your ancestor was a captain of the hockey team.
What year is that?
It's 1932. So my final example is to show you a notebook from 1801, and this is what's sitting up here at the front of the room, that you can come look at after the session, but we, again, ask that you not touch that one. It's a notebook that James McGill kept. And he was involved in middle age with a group called the Montreal Night Patrol, which is exactly what you think it is. It's a bunch of guys, middle-aged guys wandering around making sure nobody's causing trouble in the middle of the night. And what you can see up here, if you look after the presentation, is names of people who gave voluntary subscription money to pay for their protection. So everybody got the protection. People voluntarily paid a subscription fee. So, and you get a ton of names. This page is a ton of names, that page is just a ton of names. So you never know what you're going to find related to you. So I'll leave you with this other list of the sorts of material that you'll find in library special collections and in archives that might help you with your genealogy work. You may have used some of these that you were in research, but if you remember, there's much more on paper than there is online. There's a whole new world that's opening up to you. You'll probably find the most useful records in libraries and archives in the town, the county, or the state where your ancestor lived. And traveling and talking to the people there and using these materials is deeply rewarding, and even if they're on microfilm. And finally, don't believe everything you read in those settler histories or in published genealogies. Authors of those volumes are notorious for not letting the facts ruin a good story. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague Dolores.
Hi, my name is Dolores Laprade. I'm the assistant to the Vice Dean of Libraries. I'm Métis from Alberta. I'm part of the historic Métis Nation Homeland of Western Canada. I'm going to discuss some challenges you find when doing Métis genealogy, and I'll show a couple of case studies to show how you can work with these documents, because it's one thing to find the documents, it's another thing that's equally important is knowing how to work with the documents. So these are my Métis ancestors. You can see my great-grandparents. All 8 of my great-grandparents were Métis, and 15 out of my 18 great-grandparents were Métis. The top section are my great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents from Alberta. You can see by the Cardinals and Desjolins in my tree, there was a lot of intermarriage amongst the Cardinals and Desjolins, particularly in Alberta. So it can be a challenge untangling all the trees and making sure you have the correct ancestor. And because of this challenge, a few years ago, I created a Cardinal and Desjolins Descendants Métis Nation Facebook group. So anyone who's a descendant of a Cardinal or a Desjolins, in particular Métis Nation, but we also have some French-Canadian members because we all descend from the same, often from the same Cardinal and the same Desjolins who came to the New World. So we share documents and we help each other break down roadblocks. And I also recently created a Descendants of André Trottier and Louise Soto. André Trottier was from Quebec. He entered the fur trade. And we created a Cardinal and Desjolins DNA Descendants Métis Nation group on GEDmatch. So we use our DNA matches to kind of help break down roadblocks, and it's another, I could do a couple of lectures on how you use DNA, but that's kind of like an exciting new development in the field of genealogy. So where do you go for documents? Obviously, the first place you go is art fur trade documents. The progenitors of many Métis were members of the fur trade era. So you see the Hudson's Bay Fur Trade Posts. This is by no means a map of all the fur trade posts. This is over 400, but there are more fur trade posts than that. And the main repository for fur trade documents is in the Hudson's Bay Company archives, which is housed in Archives of Manitoba. In the early 1990s, HBC Company donated their records to the Archives of Manitoba. Another important source you can find for fur trade documents is found here in McGill Library. They have the Northwest Company Fur Trade Digital Connection. The Hudson's Bay Company Archives also houses Northwest Trade Company archives because in 1822, the Northwest Company merged with the Hudson's Bay Company. So if you look at, let's see, if we click this link, is it going to work? I hope it works. You can see some of the information in the HBC Company archives. You'll see service contracts for the HBC Company. You'll see marriage records, baptismal records for members who were involved in the fur trade and who are stationed at their fur trade posts. So it's a good starting place. Okay, so how do we get out of here now? Okay, thank you. I don't think I'll click another link. There we go. Another really important source of genealogical records are found in voyager contracts. So many of the members, many of the progenitors of the Métis were French-Canadian voyageurs, although you'll be surprised to know that there were actually some Iroquois, some Mohawk from Ganawake who entered the fur trade. And there were some Scottish Englishmen, especially from the Orkney and the West Highlands, who entered the fur trade. But the vast majority of the progenitors of the Métis were French-Canadian Europe. And so I have here a service record for Jacques Cardinal Sr., and you can see this parish that he came from here in Quebec. And it lists his service dates, when he worked for the Northwest Company, when he worked for the HBC. So it's a good source of information for, like I said, the progenitors of the Métis families. So the main area, the main database that you would look for is at Le Centre de Patrimoine, which is housed by and managed by La Société Historique de Saint-Boniface, and they have over 36,000 voyager records. And I'll show you another voyager. So this here is the HBC service record of André Trottier, who I descend from. This is junior. It's interesting to note that there's no service record for his father, André Trottier, who migrated from Quebec to Western Canada. We know André Trottier entered the service for trade service because we do see some records in other fur trade documents, but in terms of an actual service contract, they could find none for André Trottier. However, they found one for his son, André Trottier Jr., and it shows the parish he was born in, which is the Red River Settlement in southern Manitoba. And after the merger of the Northwest Company with the HBC in 1822, you'll find there are more Métis entering as voyageurs. Up until that time, it was, like I said, primarily French-Canadians with some other others of European descent. But after the merger in 1822, more Métis were joining the fur trade as voyageurs or in service to the fur trade companies. So another really important source of genealogical records are found in scrip records, or as you will see, they're known as half-breed scrip records. In 1870, the Canadian government devised a system of scrip referred to as Métis scrip, or in the records they were called half-breed scrip, and it was they issued these documents to people who were Métis, who were half-breeds in Western Canada, in exchange for abolition of their Aboriginal title. So the reality, though, is that most Métis who signed scrip in exchange for giving away their title to land, they never actually received the land or money. But what it did leave those of us who are descendants, what it left us with are incredible sources of genealogical information. And you will go to the Library and Archives Canada webpage, and also they're housed in the Métis Nation Historical Online Database to find those scrip records. The scripts started being handed out in 1870 in Manitoba, And then for the next 50 or 60 years, they held various script commissions across Western Canada. And let's have a look here at Library Archives in Canada. I've set it up for script for Joseph Desjardins, and this shows you when you go into archives how many records you can find that are associated with a person named Joseph Desjardins. There are 243 records that are associated with someone named Joseph Desjardins. So this is not the same Joseph, because Joseph Desjardins was a very common name. But what I like about this for the Library and Archives for LAC records is that it gives you a brief synopsis of who it was that filed this claim, whether it was for themselves, who they were married to, or where the script claim was from. So it's a good source of genealogical information. Let's go back here. Okay, it's on. Okay, so when you go to Library and Archives Canada, as I've shown you, it gives you a nice brief synopsis of what each record deals with. At the Métis Nation Historical Online database, when you go there, it'll just give you the name, Joseph Trotze or Joseph Desjardins. And if there are hundreds of records associated with one name, you don't know which particular individual it was. So it's more time-consuming going through the records. But the good thing about the Métis Nation Historical Online database is that the script records are much more legible. Some of the records at Library and Archives Canada can be very difficult to discern. So I would suggest first starting with Libraries Archives Canada. Once you know the number of the script and the year it was made, then if it's illegible, I would suggest going to the Métis Nation Historical Online database so that you can find a clearer copy so that you can see what the record looks, or what's in the record. So let's have a look at one of these scripts. This particular script was made by Louise Ladouceur, who's the widow of Joseph Beaudry, I believe. And she made it on behalf of her mother, Joseph Cardinal. So in the script, it says that her mother was first married to Joseph Ladouceur, who is French-Canadian, and then she was married secondly to Joseph Hairy Legs Desjardins. Yes, he was called Hairy Legs. Because there are so many names in common, they devised different ways of determining which Joseph it was. So someone was Joseph Hairy Legs Desjardins. Another person could have the nickname of Bear, like Musqua or something like that. So Joseph Cardinal entered into a country marriage, a marriage à la façon de paille. So these were not church-sanctioned church marriages, because the church, of course, did not exist in Western Canada during this era. So Joseph Cardinal first entered into a country marriage with Joseph Ladouceur, French-Canadian. Then he went off and entered into another country marriage with another woman. So you'll find serial marriages. In general, it's one after the other, although there are occasions where a couple will remain married in their country marriage for the duration of their partner's life. But it was more common to find people having multiple marriages throughout their life. So this is the case with Joseph Cardinal. She was first married to Joseph Ladouceur, then she married Joseph Hairy Legs Desjardins. Now the issue with that is that the children of Joseph Ladouceur were raised by Joseph Hairy Legs Desjardins. So his children became known in the records variously as Ladouceur or Desjardins, or Ladouceur de Desjardins. So I see this error often in people's ancestry trees. They'll say, oh, my ancestor was a Ladouceur de Desjardins. I must descend from Joseph Desjardins, who is French-Canadian, and Okamasqua, a boss woman, his wife. But no, not necessarily. If you're a Ladouceur de Desjardins, there's a very good chance you actually descended from Joseph Ladouceur. And this script record shows how. So this is the second and third page. So Louise Ladouceur, in her script claim, lists all the names of her siblings with their proper, like their father's surname. So this, if you come across this record, you'll be able to determine who your ancestor was. Was it Joseph Ladouceur, French-Canadian, or Joseph Hairy Legs Desjardins? And one thing I want to point out here too, it's interesting, is that the script was given in French, even though it was given in Lac-La-Biche. French was a common language spoken by the Métis. Actually, the Métis were multilingual because they were kind of like the intersection between so many indigenous groups and the fur traders. So French was one of the lingua franca of the fur trade, as well as Cree. And here in Alberta, Michif Cree became the widely spoken. Even from the Iroquois descendants, they ended up speaking Michif Cree because that was one of the lingua francas. So the next place I want to look at for documents is, of course, church records. So this church record, the churches, they arrived around, let me think, 1818 was the first time you had two priests out in Western Canada who established kind of like a little parish, but it was more like in someone's kitchen. They didn't actually establish a church, a physical church, until the 1820s in the Red River settlement. And so you started having church records, baptismal records, and then you started having actual church ceremonies. And the church didn't arrive in Western Canada, in Alberta and Saskatchewan, until, say, the 1840s, 1850s. And I don't have a record showing here, but I do have a record at home, where Joseph Cardinal, remember I showed you earlier, Joseph Cardinal, her mother, Joseph Cardinal, entered into a country marriage with Joseph Cardinal, her mother was Joseph Cardinal's mother was Louise Lisette Frobisher, who was Métis. She entered into a country marriage with Joseph Cardinal, who was French-Canadian. So they entered into a country marriage, they had children, they were together for several decades. And then 1844, when the priests arrived in Alberta, all of a sudden you get all these marriages and you think, oh, they've met, because we're thinking from our mentality, oh, they've met, now they're getting married, when in fact they'd been married for a few decades before before their marriage was solemnized by the church in 1844. So the church arrives and you think, great, now it's clear, I know who my ancestors are, I can find this record, but it's not so clear with the Métis. And this is the marriage record for my ancestors, William Desjardins D. Okenese and Isabel Cardinal D. Dion. This is a photo of my great-grandmother, my Chapan Isabel Cardinal. Now, when I was growing up, I heard about, I knew her as Isabel Cardinal, and I knew some stories, like her family was from Frog Lake, and she was alive in 1885 during the Métis resistance. She was alive in Frog Lake when the Northwest Mounted Police and the Army came to squell the Métis Rebellion, and that was actually those were the last shots fired for the Métis Rebellion. So she was alive at that time. She was a young girl. So I knew her as Isabel Cardinal. And when I started doing genealogy, and I'm looking through the records, trying to find records for William Desjardins, I knew him as William Desjardins, and I come across this record for William Desjardins D. Okenese and Isabel Dion, and I go, well, no, that's not my great-grandparents, it's not the right names. But if you go and you continue looking through the records, here's a record entry for baptisms for Johnny Desjardins, in brackets Okenese, and another record for Simon Okenese, in brackets Desjardins. And their parents are named variously William Desjardins or William Okenese, and the mother's variously named Isabel Dion or Isabel, with a Cree word I'm not going to attempt to pronounce, Métis something or other, sorry, Chapan. And then I find another baptismal record, and this one is of Marie Rose Okenese, and you can see it lists her father as William Okenese and her mother as Isabel Cardinal Dion. And it's like, bingo, it is the right person. She had a D name of Dion, which I wasn't even aware of, because I grew up knowing her as Isabel Cardinal. And then in this Facebook group that I had created for Cardinal and Desjardins descendants, a member of the extended family went to the Alberta archives, and she found a record from St. Raphael's Church in Le Golf, Alberta, which listed the Desjardins Okenese family. And you can see William Okanese here, and it doesn't list the name of his first wife. We know her name was Marie from other records. It lists some of their children. And then it lists his marriage with Isabel Cardinal. And there's Johnny Okanese and Caroline. There's Jimmy, that's my grandfather, James Desjardins. And below that, it lists the children, or the marriage of Johnny Okanese or Desjardins with Caroline Gladue or Myoscopes and their children. So this document shows you how the names can change through time. And so you have D names with the Métis because they inherited that from their French-Canadian ancestors. So in some documents, there'll be a cardinal. In some documents, there'll be a Dion. And you might think they're two different individuals, but they're not. And so it can be a challenge ensuring that you have the correct person because of all the similarities in names, or ensuring that you have all the documents because then the name changes. They use nicknames, and they will have names in different languages. So in French, they might have one name. In an Indigenous language, a Cree language, they might have another name. So they are known by different languages, by different names in different languages. And this really highlights the importance of having multiple records for each individual and finding records for the extended family too, because then you can get a broader picture and a fuller picture of your ancestors. So I want to quickly point out some other online resources. You can go to the Gabrielle Dumont Institute. It's a very good starting point for Métis genealogy because they have a virtual museum of Métis history and culture online. They have a biography section. There's a link here. I'm not going to click it because I don't want to get lost in the link. But they have a biography section listing hundreds and hundreds of different Métis families. It's by no means conclusive, but it's a good starting point. It's a good starting point. Another place to look at is in Glenbow Archives of Glenbow Museum. Unfortunately, the Glenbow Museum is closed right now, and a lot of their archives are only available in person. So if you're in Calgary, Alberta, it's great. If you're out east like me, not so great. But they do have one source here which you can access online, and this is the genealogy of the first Métis Nation, the development and dispersal of the Red River settlement from 1820 to 1900. It's like a snapshot. It's like a census records. It gives the name, the husband, the wife, the children. Sometimes you'll get information about how many cows and pigs they have in their household, stuff like that. So there you have it. So I've just given you a whirlwind introduction to Métis genealogy. And as my chaplain would say, merci. I'll hand it back to Okay, so do you want me to do a thank you? Okay, you're coming, okay.
I'm bringing my own laptop with me. For all of those of you who are tuning in online, I'll repeat, if you have questions, roadblocks, stories that you want to share about your own genealogical research, do send those by email to roar, which is not the standard roar spelling, roaar.library@mcgill.ca, and I'll get those here and I can voice them on your behalf. But yes, thank you to our presenters. And well, one thing I will also add is for everyone who's registered, we will send out a follow-up message that does include links to this PowerPoint with all of the relevant links. So don't worry about that, you'll get that. You'll also get a link to the recording so you can rewatch all of this if you prefer to hear it again. But we will share that. I do have one question that came in already to start us off. And this came in from Mary David. And she has hit a roadblock, as I think is very common in genealogical research. And I think one of my follow-up questions will be on that topic. But Marie David did hit a particular roadblock. So I'll tell you her story on her behalf, and we'll see perhaps, Jen, you might have an answer that maybe, we'll see. Between all of you, you might come up with something. So she's researching what happened to her great-uncle, who was sent to a residential school in Ontario. She has found baptism records, but is having a hard time determining his exact age and what happened to him. We believe he died at the residential school, but there is some mystery there. One record shows that he was sent to an orphanage in Montreal, which brings us to these local resources. And that's where they hit a roadblock, unfortunately, because the orphanage, which was a Protestant orphanage, no longer exists. They don't know where to look to find out what happened to him. It's also difficult because a lot of the records are in French. for local history, and Marie does not speak French. So I guess the roadblock is, specifically, what happens to those records when an institution no longer exists? Maybe you have some strategies to work around that. Maybe Jen, maybe Kristen, if you can brainstorm. Yeah.
Thanks. So this is definitely a hard problem. So, not everything survived and made its way to libraries and archives today. I'm not. My Quebec ancestors were in St. Hyacinthe, and nobody was in Montreal, so I don't have lots of experience with the Montreal level records. But in general, especially for a church that is no longer exists, I would look at the neighboring churches, what the same denomination at that time. The most likely thing that happened is that those papers were transferred to the next town over. If not, I'm trying to think if I can have any other recommendations, but that's where I would start, for sure.
So I have a follow-up question on the subject of roadblocks. And I encourage anyone in the room, if you have hit roadblocks, I encourage you to share them. But myself, I would classify myself as a Genealogy 1.0 student. I'm still at that initial stage. My brother has been doing more of the genealogical research in my family. And this question maybe I'll pose to Dolores, because you mentioned some of your experience with creating social groups for your genealogical research. But my question is about the topic of social networks as tools for genealogical research. Today we were really looking at these scholarly and archival resources, but you seem to have integrated those two in some of your Facebook groups. So I wonder if you could comment about that social networking side of genealogical research.
In my experience, there are a lot of Facebook groups out there with people who are interested in genealogy. And there are some like the ones that I created, which are family specific. Also, there are others which are related to specific regions, like I'm on GEDmatch, so I know that there GEDmatch, which is for people who take DNA, it's free to join GEDmatch. And there are many ancestor projects on GEDmatch. So you can look to say you're a Mackenzie. I know on GEDmatch there's a Mackenzie Ancestors Project. I would go on Facebook or just go on the internet and start searching, Mackenzie Family Group, or like I know my ancestors, many of them were from the Red River Settlement. Well, there's a Red River Settlement Facebook group, and we share documents, we share roadblocks, and I find in this day and age, it's been really wonderful because I'm here in Montreal. I no longer live in Alberta. I don't have access to these documents. So we'll have members of the extended family who go on these little genealogy vacations or genealogy tours, and they go to the Lac La Biche mission, and they get and they get documents, and then they share them with the rest of the Facebook group. So I really do, it's been, a very rich and rewarding experience finding them. It's just a few clicks away. Do some online searches, you'll find groups. If you descend from Robinsons or from a particular region, there's Scottish descendants groups on Facebook, and there are a lot of people who are willing to share their documents with you.
I kind of failed on my own introduction in that I am also many generations settler, and I have a very peculiar spelling to my maiden name. And so we've hit roadblocks in my own family history because we found that the spelling of our name changed multiple times. And tracing that back was work that my grandfather did. So it went from just D-E-A-L to D''E-A-L and then another one. So if you try and find deals, you'll find really only my clan these days. But it is a really valuable thing to be able to connect with people who are doing the same kind of research that you are through those social networks. What we heard from today are some of these rich resources that really do take you to the next level. I've actually done some digging into the Levels directory, the very large one, on the behalf of some researchers who are looking specifically, not necessarily for genealogy connections, but for businesses and their owners. And you can trace those through the same resources. I do have one follow-up question, once again for Jen. You did mention a very useful piece of advice that finding the location, like the town, state, or county, that specific place where your ancestors are from, is really, really a crucial first step. My question, once again, from a 1.0 perspective, how do you get to that first step? If you're tracing someone, maybe it's like me and the spelling has changed over time, how do you get to that first step of tracing to where you can find those richer records?
Thanks, Jacqueline. So if you're, one of the first tools of a genealogist is vital records, so birth, marriage, death. And those are typically held at the county level in the United States. I think most of the, I'm actually not sure in Canada if they're held at the county level, but if you're looking at the United States, they're definitely at the county level. So if you're in the census, the decennial census, you can find what city they were living in that time, what electoral district, what city, and you can just look up very easily what county that was in. You should also pay attention to historical maps because boundaries change over time. So the county that place exists now may not be the county that it was at the time. And there's a really good set of resources of historical U.S. maps available from the Newberry Library in Chicago. Unfortunately, I don't know about the boundary changes in Canada. I'm less familiar with those, but I'm sure we can look that up.
If there are questions in the room, we're happy to take them as well. Just give me a finger and we'll run you a microphone, actually, Stephen.
So it's just a quick comment.
Just a minute. There you go. There you go.
Sorry, it's just a quick comment. I actually work in the library, so I have a vested interest in my colleagues who have spoken.
Yeah.
But anything that we have here in print is available to anybody who would like to access those materials. So we emphasize that we're a public institution, so that means the materials belong to everybody. So if someone wants to come and consult, for instance, the fur trade documents or the diaries or other papers, just have to come in. Ideally, it would be helpful if someone made an appointment so we could properly prepare. But if you happen to show up at the desk, we'll make the stuff available to you also. So that's my plug for the library.
Well, thank you, Stephen. That's kind. Yes, I will add a couple details to that in that our reading room is open Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., and we are delighted to help you with these kinds of projects. And we do need a little prep time, especially for the archival collections, because that's usually stored in a facility up the hill or sometimes in the basement, so we do need a little time to retrieve. There is one follow-up comment on the local Montreal records, and that's to point out from PW once more. Language changes also is something that you have to consider because an ancestor may have been known as Peter and then it was recorded as Pierre depending on where they lived and if the records shifted between different parishes. Thing to throw into the mix. I have one other question, if there's any from the room. Again, for Delora, actually. Partly that also has to do with this question of language and the way people call themselves. And of course, we're looking at the records today. You were highlighting records that do exist. Of course, most of those, as you pointed out, are created by the government, by the church once it arrived. What I was curious about is the way that people are identified in those documents are always as they were identified by the powers that created those documents. So they're not necessarily created by people by themselves about themselves. I was curious, in your research, have you found existing documents that maybe are not held in institutions like this one, but rather by people, by Indigenous peoples that were created by them about them? Is that something that you've come across, or is that something that it just is very much harder to find?
So for the majority of Métis early on were not literate. They may have spoken multiple languages, but most of them were not literate, most of them were not educated. Yes, there were some, say the Scottish. I know of some records where a Scottish Métis offspring was sent to Scotland or sent to Montreal for further their education, and then after they had become available back into Western Canada and enter the fur trade. But you know what, that would be very interesting. I haven't actually come across of any records. I've only read in script or some of the fur trade records, notes saying so-and-so was sent to Scotland for their education and then returned to Western Canada. In terms of the by Indigenous people, I would look to Louis Riel, who was Métis from the Red River settlement, and he was sent here to Montreal for his education. There are a lot of records, and you can have access to those through Library and Archives Canada. I've read through some of his records. So, and there's another one, the name escapes me, that was written around the 1880s by someone who was Métis. But up until that point, many of the Métis were not literate, so they weren't producing records, they weren't producing documents. And there were a lot of oral traditions. But the thing with oral traditions is that when you have an oral tradition, you usually have these rules about how you pass on the information. And it's supposed to be passed on as accurately as possible. And I remember when I was always interested in family history. So I remember talking to my father as a child, and he would talk about when the people came from over there, when they came from over there, and he'd nod his head, meaning the Red River settlement. And he said that Mama, my mother, Mama had who came, and he was known as something like flies with wings, flies about. And wouldn't you know, when going through script records and baptismal records, my mother did have a Métis ancestor. One was vent de bout, so flies about, and another one, another Métis ancestor. I can't remember the name in Cree, but it means flies around. He was quite a well-known Métis chief. And so they passed down this oral history. It's not written down, it's oral. But with a lot of oral traditions, there are rules because it's not written down. You have to pass it down exactly as it was told to you.
Thank you. We have one final question from afar, and we're just about at the end of our time, or, well, I guess we're 1 minute over, but I think I can squeak in one more. In approximately 1851 to 52, an ancestor gave up 2 of their 4 children, who were twins, Catherine and James Hewitt, for adoption in the Tadoussac area of Quebec. This question comes in from the online crowd, is wondering how adoptions are documented in the records. I don't know if any of you have insights about that?
I don't. I have no idea.
Okay, there's one for future follow-up for our librarians. Ooh.
I know a bit about how adoptions were recorded in the 16th century, so a little bit too early, and I'm not so sure about until much more recently, where we see much more closed adoptions. But I will point out something that might be a useful resource is on this first link that we McGill Genealogy guide, which is a guide that I've created. There are a lot of links to Montreal and Quebec resources, some in English, more in French, but there are bilingual resources for doing genealogy, specifically in Montreal as well as in Quebec more largely. And so that would be, if I was receiving this question as a librarian, that's where I would suggest someone start looking, is on the resources that I have available on the genealogy guide. I will also note for those of you who are interested in genealogy a bit further afield in the rest of Canada or the rest of North America or worldwide, there are also sections on this guide that will point you to looking in the States, looking to the rest of Canada, and even looking beyond, depending on your ancestry. So I can't answer that question specifically, but as a librarian tries to do, I can give some resources to point you to.
Thank you for that. Stephen has one more, but...
I'll be quick.
Okay, microphone for Stephen. Thank you.
I watch, it's called Finding Your Roots on PBS. I find that show fascinating. I don't know if anybody else has seen it. It's with Henry Louis Gates, who's a historian. So what often they do on that show, I mean, they pick out celebrities and they go back at their roots. But it's interesting, they often look at ship manifests. In other words, the passenger list of boats that landed at wherever the boats landed. So is that kind of stuff available in Canada? So in other words, if a boat landed in Montreal or Halifax, it's
Yes,
Pier
absolutely.
21.
Yes, and there's a link in the slide deck, actually. Jen included one of those as a very common source for
Thank you. Okay,
historical
thank you.
documents.
I'll stop.
No, it's a pleasure. As you can see, librarians, we are wired to want to provide and share information. So I really do thank my colleagues for this session. We'll give them a round of applause. And thank you all for coming and joining us for this homecoming event. If you are interested in the other ones, I do encourage you to check out any of the other homecoming events at the library and happening this week and this weekend. So thanks for joining us and have a good afternoon. For you in the room, do come up and have a look at the resources at the front if you're curious.